Welcome to episode 3 of our Western Queensland trip. In this episode, we leave Quilpie and make our way to Eromanga before continuing on the Cooper Developmental Road and Bundina Roads towards Nocundra. On leaving Quilpie, we made our way along the Diamantina Developmental Road, crossing through the Bulu Floodplains and long straight stretches lined with mulga, gibber country and more open downs flood-out country. We were again treated to native gum trees in blossom. This leg of the journey turned out to be more than just long stretches of bitumen, but ever-changing scenery. The area is so isolated, but still holds beauty through the magical rich red landscape, the abandoned homesteads, old wooden and new wire fences that stretch for miles across the landscape, the isolated mining sites, all highlighting the existence of those who have travelled, lived, worked, or are still living and working in the area. There is a constant reminder of those who came before. European exploration in the early 19th century was followed by settlers moving stock over thousands of kilometres to establish vast pastoral properties. Bullock teams bought supplies and returned to the coast with wool and hides. Minerals were discovered and settlements grew into towns, though sadly only shells of those towns remain. Plains and low ridges are dominated by drought-tolerant mulga, which grows in almost pure stands or interdispersed with grasslands and eucalypts. Its silver grey foliage and dark fissured bark contrast beautifully against the deep red soils. On deeper sandy soils, soft mulga grows as dense woodlands, but on shallow soils or hard residual ridges, hard mulga is stunted and sparse. Mulga utilises every drop of moisture it can capture with its foliage designed to channel all water down towards its deep taproots. Its thin silvery grey foliage is designed to minimise moisture loss in sun and heat. Along creeks and rivers we saw coolabah, red river gums, black box and yapanya, with mitchell grass and spinifex on the open country. This area of southwest Queensland is certainly a challenging environment, facing droughts, floods, economic depression and the occasional good season. About halfway to Eromanga, we turned onto the Cooper Developmental Road. Signs that we were entering dinosaur country was evident by the sculptures alongside the road. We arrived in Eromanga on the edge of the ancient Eromanga Inland Sea, once a rich aquatic wonderland filled with marine life, around mid-morning. Eromanga was once called Opalopolis, given its history of opal fossicking, and is reputedly Australia's furthest town from the sea. The town is sustained by surrounding pastoral properties, some of which are over 8,000 square kilometres, and is home to the Eromanga oil and gas basin, which produces around 1.5 million barrels of oil each year. In Notausaurus Park, we were amazed by Notausaurus, a life-sized sculpture of a sauropod and her two babies. The giant mother stands over 3.5 metres tall and 10 metres long. The sculptures were installed in Brisbane's Queen Park during the 2014 G20 Summit and were gifted to the Outback Gondwana Foundation in 2016. These sauropods, which represent a group of dinosaurs which grew up to 40 metres long, have a special connection to Eromanga, being the place where the largest ever dinosaur from the sauropod group in Australia were discovered. Rick and I took a tour of the museum, where we were treated to the spectacular world of dinosaurs and megafauna from the Cretaceous period. We got to touch a 95 million year old dinosaur bone, watch fossil preparation and restoration in action. It was incredible. Rick and I also saw the incredible Euro-megafauna fossils and met the titanosaur called Cooper, Australia's largest dinosaur. There were racks and racks of bones in large casts awaiting years of painstaking technical unveiling. In the theaterette we watched an amazing video that highlighted the timeline of dinosaurs. It is hard to imagine that between 95 and 98 million years ago, dinosaurs stalked this expansive outback land. Evidence of their existence came about when the skeletal remains of Australia's largest dinosaur were found on a local station and are now housed in the Eromanga Natural History Museum. The museum is committed to conserving and showcasing the fossils, natural and cultural heritage from the prehistoric and modern-day environments of the Upper Murray-Darling and Lake Eyre Cooper basins. Fossilised skeletons of 40 to 50 giant diprotodons have been discovered by university and museum scientists between Ullo, Eromanga and Quilpie, the largest concentration of the creatures anywhere in Australia. Diprotodons ranged across inland Australia for tens of thousands of years, coexisting with the indigenous people following their arrival to Australia. These megafaunas lived approximately 50,000 to 100,000 years ago, becoming extinct about 25,000 years ago. The diprotodon was like a huge wombat, about 2 metres tall and weighing 2 tons, with a rear-facing pouch able to carry the equivalent of a small child. They had an oversized head and walked pigeon-toed. If you ever have the opportunity, a visit to the museum is certainly well worth the time. Rick and I had so much to ponder from our visit to Eromanga. What an amazing experience for a town so far from the sea. We had never expected to have such an insightful and enjoyable experience. On leaving Eromanga, we were again travelling long stretches of road, rich red gibber country, flood-out country with mulga, gidgee, mitchell and kangaroo grass. The road varied from narrow to wide bitumen, areas where the sides of the road had been either washed away or worn away by passing vehicles. Frequently we crossed floodways marked with metre-high markers. Innamicka Creek that flows into the Wilson River with its hydrologic stream flow reference station about 4 kilometres from the creek, and an old bronco branding yard once used to hold mustard cattle. We were again entering the Bulu Shire and leaving the Quilpie Shire behind. The vast expansive landscape was both stunning and unique. Red sandstone flats, mitchell grass downs and flood-out country covered in herbage, a diverse range of eucalypt from open forest and woodlands of gidgee, mulga and some brigalow, open downs country used traditionally for grazing by sheep and cattle, through large cattle stations and ancient lands. As well, there was evidence of oil and gas exploration in the area. The Great Artesian Basin supplies reliable water from deep underground and underpins the region's geological and pastoral history. This basin formed when Australia's centre sagged and filled with sediments from rivers and lakes, creating layers of porous, water-holding sandstone. Later, sea levels rose to create vast inland seas. Over time, seabed sediments compressed into bands of impenetrable rock, trapping fresh water below. Millions of years of weathering and erosion since have carved flat-top hills or messes of hard, water-resistant rocks rising above a vast, wide landscape, with occasional watercourses, shallow inland lakes and clay pans. Here and there, water from the Great Artesian Basin forces to the surface as mound springs and soaks. Outback Queensland has not always been a dry place. Lush rainforests once covered large areas, but with the onset of a cooler, drier climate about 30 million years ago, these were gradually replaced by grasslands and eucalypt forests and seasonal dryness. Southwest of Quilpie in the floodplains, forests and grasslands, great vegetarian megafauna and Australia's largest marsupial once roamed. As the centuries passed, the climate and conditions became ripe for fossil formation, which has resulted in the region becoming a rich source of marine, dinosaur and megafauna fossils. After driving kilometres and kilometres along straight stretches of the Cooper Developmental Road, over rises, wide open countryside, and along and across watercourses, who would have thought that a sharp left-hand turn was required to continue following the major road, now the Bundina Road, or we would have ended up at Durham Downs. Durham Downs, a cattle station in the magnificent Channel Country is over 8,910 square kilometres, with frontage to 69 kilometres of Cooper Creek, with its fertile floodplains and associated tributaries. It is one of the highest regarded grazing blocks in Australia. The property's extensive rolling stony tablelands with mitchell grass down each side of the floodplain and gibber country make it suitable for breeding and backgrounding young steers. The property was originally established in the 1870s and in the early 1900s once belonged to Sydney Kidman and Co. before being sold in 1918 due to heavy stock losses caused by droughts, resulting in financial hardship. Rick and I talked about those early pioneers, droving cattle, forging a homestead, making a living, surviving floods, drought, dust storms, flies and isolation. What it took for them to survive in such an isolated area of Queensland. It takes a truly remarkable person to face this day in, day out and still want to live here. After travelling through such varied and interesting country, we made our camp at the Innamicka turnoff, about 30 kilometres north of Nocundra. I thought we could have been on top of the world with 360-degree views of the landscape. It was such an amazing place. We were on top of a stunning red plateau that gave way to creeks and floodplains, covered in short shrubs and mulga and gidgee. I loved the peace and quiet. It felt good for the soul. The stillness of the landscape, with the only interruptions the flies, the odd whirly wind, and the occasional twitter of birds. Usually when we make camp there is a willy wagtail to greet us, but not today. The horsetail clouds streaked across the sky from the southwest, the dusty pinks of the landscape, the colours an artist's dream. No matter how many photographs I take, I just could not capture the true essence of the landscape or the setting sun. Human eyesight is a truly amazing gift, to be able to see the depth of colour and space, the shape and clear contrast over the vast expanse of distance. I try to capture the images I see with the camera, but it frustrates me on occasions, as when I check the photographs, they lack the depth I can see with my eyes. I am truly thankful that I have my eyesight, as I have seen some truly amazing landscapes, scenery, and captivating and fascinating places of interest. As the afternoon progressed, Rick and I enjoyed sitting in the shade of the caravan, except for the flies. The turnoff was quiet, with only 2 trucks passing in opposite directions, one heading from Innamicka and the other a Napameri truck heading home. There was no traffic travelling towards Nocundra. During the night we heard a mob of unsettled weaners investigating the boundary of the paddock they had been let out into. It brought back memories of yesteryear. Weaners in the cattle yards, mobs of cattle bellowing, the atmosphere of total outback tranquility, while overhead the brilliant night sky. I was certainly feeling content. In the distance we could see Nocundra Station, a bullock fattening property over 2 million acres or approximately 8,500 square kilometres, originally operated by the Hughes family for over 120 years until 1990, before being sold, and Nocundra on the Wilson River, where we had previously camped on our return journey on our Darling River Run trip. From the turnoff we made our way along the Innamicka road towards the Dig Tree. Plateaus gave way to channels, gradual rises and long stretches of road. We would crest a rise only to be amazed by the sheer vastness of the landscape before us. The channels green against the red earth, the sky with its different shades of blue, gibber plains, oil and gas wells, open treeless plains. Then came the amazing hills. We travelled through the Jackson oil fields, the largest onshore oil field in Australia near Durham Down Station, processing oil from the Eromanga Basin and the Cooper Basin. The field was discovered in 1981 and contains 350 million barrels of oil. The Cooper Basin is a sedimentary basin mainly in southwestern Queensland, but also extends into northeastern South Australia, and was named after Cooper Creek, and for the most is overlain by the Eromanga Basin. The Cooper Basin covers an area of 130,000 square kilometres. On the surface, the landscape is mostly desert, including parts of the Simpson, Stony Desert and the Channel Country. Oil and gas exploration of the basin began in 1962, with oil and gas located 1,250 metres below the surface. Within the Cooper Basin, there are about 160 gas fields with about 630 wells producing gas, and 75 oil fields with more than 340 wells in production. The basin also hides an impact crater, created about 300 million years ago. The crater's minimum diameter is approximately 80 kilometres, making it one of the largest of Australia's 30 to 50 known or suspected craters. Having lived in rural areas of central, north and northwest Queensland, I have travelled much of Queensland and thought that I had a favourable amount of knowledge about Australia, especially Queensland. But the more I travel and read up on places we have travelled through, I find myself sadly very ignorant. So much of our country is never talked about. It is such a shame. There is so much more out there to explore, learn about and discover than just the coastal areas and tourist attractions. We crossed the single-lane bridge over Cooper Creek. The floodplains were alive with an amazing number of small birds that took flight from the tall stands of lignin along the roadside. Cowvine and other herbage also dominated the floodplains, and the good feed we were seeing was the result of local rains. The floodwaters in the Cooper need to be 4.3 metres high at the causeway at Durham Downs homestead for at least 3 months for the waters of the Cooper to reach Lake Eyre. When the water height reaches 4.6 metres high and is about 29 kilometres wide, it is classed as a good flood. Sometimes the floodwater spreads as wide as 70 kilometres in major flood events. When floods occur in succession, the second flood will travel slower due to vegetations that grow after the first flood. Little floods fill up the waterholes along the river, wet the catchment and allow the next flood to go further. We could see for miles and miles. The fuel truck we were following gave us an indication of where the road was heading. Quite often it stood out against the open flat downs country, silhouetted against the blue horizon. Rick and I knew about the Channel Country, also known as Corner Country and Kidman Country, before this trip, but I had never been to this area before last year, when we travelled back from our Corner Country trip. This labyrinth of braided channels and fertile floodplains had me fascinated. The Georgina, Diamantina and Cooper Creek river systems do not flow permanently. Rather, the semi-arid rivers fill every few years after long dry spells and bring the vast floodplains to life with native grasses and wildflowers. During these wet periods, a complex network of waterways form that support native plants and animals. During the dry periods, the water system is reduced to isolated waterholes and wetlands that provide crucial habitat for the animals that depend on them until the next big wet. Even the artesian springs contain endemic wildlife not found anywhere else in the world. The Cooper region alone has 8 nationally important wetlands and 26 threatened species. I wonder how long can this fragile environment continue to survive. We will leave you for this episode at the entrance to Nappamerri Station Homestead on Cooper Creek. Join us for our next episode where we visit the Dig Tree and then make our way to Innamicka. Take care and stay safe. Cheers for now, Rick and Rosemary. R&R Living Life.